The politics of Latin America are diverse and multifaceted, but a common trend among many countries is the significant disparity between the working class and the wealthy elite. This economic imbalance leads to high levels of poverty, which in turn often results in electoral support for left-wing political movements that promise to address these issues at the root. However, in Brazil, right-wing populism has significant support, as demonstrated by the strong showing of President Jair Bolsonaro in the 2022 presidential election. Yet it was President Lula Da Silva who won the election. Icon of the working class, a former metal worker and union leader, Lula is now serving a record third term as president. Now, the Workers' Party could have an opportunity and the political capital to settle a new social contract. Was this a coup attempt? Does Lula da Silva hold enough international support? With this and many other questions in mind, Voice of the Resistance spoke to two of Brazil's main authors and intellectuals, Frei Betto, author, political activist, philosopher, and former Dominican friar, and Emir, author, sociologist, and political scientist.
O que é passado é que, efetivamente, Lula era o único candidato capaz de ganhar de Bolsonaro.
Well, what has happened is that indeed Lula was the only candidate capable of beating Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was a very militarized four-year government with a very effective job of deforming people's consciences.
De deformação de la consciência de la gente. Governo que tinha por base o medo.
A government that was based on a fear of returning to the military dictatorship and accusing Lula of being corrupt, communist and all that. And since the population of Brazil is very conservative,
a população de Brasil é muito conservadora, então ele teve apoio aí de 58.
He had the support of 58 million voters, but Lula had 60 million voters, or a little more, and by a small margin. We recognize that fact. Lula won the elections, yet the Bolsonaristas do not want to acknowledge that.
Não querem reconhecer isso, então este domingo, 8 de enero.
And on Sunday, January 8th, these people made a coup attempt, an attempt to destabilize our institutions. These people have no proposal. These people, even now, will have no leadership because Bolsonaro went to the United States. He abandoned his people, and they are desperate.
Abandonou sua gente, então essa gente está desesperada.
President Lula da Silva, who was at the moment visiting communities affected by flooding in Sao Paulo, quickly took action by having a judge from the Supreme Court remove Ivanez Rocha, the governor of Brasilia. He also intervened in the police department of Brasilia, which had been lenient towards the protesters. Anderson Torres, who had just assumed the role of security secretary for the federal district, and Fabio Vieira, former military police commander of the federal district, were arrested and charged. Over 1,500 rioters had been apprehended, interrogated, charged, and investigated. They are also being held financially responsible for the damage caused to the 3 government buildings.
In practice, it's as if they took Brasilia. Eventually, security forces finally took care of it with almost no resistance, which indicates that initially there was an enormous weakness in the existing defenses, both from the police and the armed forces. Even though the occupation was apparently pure and simple vandalism without an evident goal. We could speculate that, eventually, sectors of the armed forces could have alleged that the government did not have the capacity to maintain order in Brasilia and step in to fill that void. I don't know what would happen in that case because it would not have had any kind of support, but I only speculate that something more serious could have happened until more or less 2 hours later security forces began to flow and the spaces were recovered.
In this video released by Diario do Nordeste, We can see an army colonel trying to impede the arrest of Bolsonaro's activists. There are obvious similarities with the January 6 riots in the US Capitol. We asked Frei Betto if he agrees with such an assessment.
Sim, muito similar. É uma gente mimética, uma gente que tem.
Yes, it is very similar. These are very imitative people. These are people who also have Donald Trump as their main reference, because Bolsonaro is a disciple of Trump.
Incluso não é por acaso que Bolsonaro agora está em Miami para estar aí cerca de Trump.
Bolsonaro has never hidden his admiration for Trump. Bolsonaro is even in Miami to be close to Trump, and at the same time, his people want to imitate Trumpism.
De espaço físico, os três palácios estão muito cercas, em la Plaza de los Tres Poderes em Brasília.
The difference here is its population and physical space. The three palaces are very close in the Plaza de los Tres Poderes in Brasilia, and all this made it easier for people to arrive and do all this damage to the buildings, the works of art, the many things from the history of the country that were in palaces, and even photos of all the country's presidents have been damaged. But everything is now under control, although we know that we are going to live with a Bolsonarista culture. Just as Trumpism culture is very strong in the United States, Bolsonarism culture is very strong in Brazil. We'll have to live with that.
Aqui é muito forte a cultura bolsonarista. Vamos conviver com isso.
Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva declared that fanatical fascists, they did what never has been done in the history of this country. It is important to remember that the Brazilian left has had people tortured and people killed. There have been people disappeared, and we have never heard any news about any leftist party, any leftist movement invading the National Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Planalto Palace. It has no precedent in the history of the country. There is no precedent for what these people have done, and for that, these people will have to be punished. And we are even going to find out who are the financiers of these vandals who went to Brasilia. We'll find who paid for this, and they'll all pay by force of law. This is an irresponsible gesture, certainly anti-democratic, a gesture of vandals and fascists.
Esse gesto antidemocrático e esse gesto de vândalos e de fascistas.
Bolsonaro supporters had been allowed to camp outside government buildings, calling for the military to depose the elected president and let the incumbent stay on power. After the attack, Lula deposed 80 military ministers and seemed to have fully regained control of the situation.
Incluso
There were even agents protecting those who were demonstrating as they went to the premises that they eventually invaded and destroyed. So there was a complacency and a very clear collusion that took an hour and a half or two, what for us here seemed like an eternity, because they occupied government buildings and began to destroy valuable cultural objects as well as furniture. I would say the following: if certain sectors of the armed forces, dissatisfied with the electoral result, had truly assumed the lead of the fight, the leadership of the movement, then we could have seen a more serious result.
The current political polarization in Brazil stems in part from the fact that former President Lula Da Silva, who had served 2 terms in office from 2003 to 2010, was jailed for corruption in 2018. However, in 2021, Brazil's Supreme Court reinstated Da Silva's political rights and ruled that Judge Sergio Moro was biased in his verdict and intentionally interfered in the 2018 election by falsely condemning Lula, thus preventing him from running against eventual President Jair Bolsonaro. Sergio Moro went on to serve as Minister of Justice under Jair Bolsonaro. This is just one example of the deep divide between Brazil's left and right.
Quando assumiu a presidência, desarrollou muito intensamente discurso del ódio.
When Bolsonaro assumed the presidency, a hate speech, a speech of aggressiveness towards the opposition, towards the media, towards the judiciary, etc., developed very intensely. So it was like a climate of aggressive, violent mobilization was prepared. When defeat came, Bolsonaro's defeat, he then did not acknowledge defeat, but neither did he claim that there was fraud or something like that. Even before his inauguration, Lula took office as president, establishing relationships and discussing relationships, including with international players, receiving representatives from other parties, and starting to build his government. At that point, Lula's presidency became a fact. There was no way to go back on it. Bolsonaro resigned in some way when he left the country with his mandate still in effect. He didn't even apply for a travel license, which would be normal. His vice president said that he did not talk to him about anything, did not arrange anything. He just left, just like that, for Miami, which was one more way to recognize the results. And Lula's inauguration on January 1 was spectacular, a great act. With that symbolic image of Lula going up the ramp of the Planalto Palace as a representative of the most excluded sectors of society, blacks, women, indigenous people, handicapped people, etc. And in the absence of Bolsonaro, a useful and efficient absence, it was a black woman who collected garbage on the street who put the presidential sash on Lula. But there continued to be attacks on electrical towers here and there by Bolsonaristas before the day of Lula's promotion.
De Lula, hubo actos violentos en Brasilia, ¿no?
Media is sometimes called the fourth power, and for a reason. In most countries of the world, mass media has a large influence on public opinion. Latin America is no different. In fact, in one of our earlier reports, we discussed with Atilio Boron what he called a tyranny of the media and the judiciary in Argentina. We asked Frei Betto about how this compares to the influence of the media in Brazil.
No, aquí es diferente de Argentina.
No, here it is very different from Argentina. First, because the mainstream media, which has always been very critical of the Workers' Party and Lula,
apoyou a Lula porque não suportava Bolsonaro, sobretudo porque Bolsonaro
this time supported Lula because they could not stand Bolsonaro, especially because Bolsonaro was censoring the media and Bolsonaro was offending the media. The majority of the country has taken a position favorable to Lula,
favorable a Lula, ao contrário de Argentina.
The opposite of Argentina. And here too, the Supreme Court has acted very firmly in favor of democracy, that is, against the measures of Bolsonaro and his ministers. In short, this is something that has greatly favored Lula.
E de seus ministros, enfim, e o que ha favorecido muito a Lula.
Perhaps one of the most important institutions which normally tip the balance of power in Latin America are the armed forces. A government can stand or fall depending on their support or lack thereof.
Las Fuerzas Armadas, desde el golpe.
The armed forces, since the military coup that ended in Brazil, which ended in the 1980s, have maintained the national security doctrines. They always have the idea that they are the reserve against Brazil becoming a Venezuela, a Nicaragua, a Cuba, etc. They always maintain that they never did self-criticism. And in the Lula government in 2009, there was what should have been done in the resumption of democracy in 1985, a truth commission, which investigated the crimes committed by the military, precisely torture, etc., that affected them, even more so than they were before. So they are, I would say that they are the sector, the basic nucleus of resistance to democracy in Brazil. They may not act. Lula is talking to them, saying that they have nothing to do with democracy, that their role is to defend national security, etc. That is to say, for the moment they are demobilized, let's say, but they continue to be a repository, an enclosure, the reserve of the right.
Della derecha.
To put in perspective the calls for military takeover and the extent of the political divide in Brazil, we will examine the findings of the country's Truth Commission. In Brazil, a military regime ruled the country for 21 years, from 1965 to 1984, committing massive human rights violations, squashing freedom of the press and repressing political opposition. According to the final report of the Commission released on December 10 of 2014, under President Dilma Rousseff.
On July 1, 1969, the Bandeirante operation was created in Sao Paulo financed by multinationals such as Grupo Ultra, Ford, and General Motors.
Operation Bandeirante went on to commit severe human rights violations. According to the Truth Commission report,
it was the personnel of the Execution Coordination Task Force who was responsible, by determination of the upper echelons, for the acts of illegal imprisonment, interrogations, torture, executions, and forced disappearances of militants.
One of those tortured in a secret location was Dilma Rousseff herself, a former insurgent against the dictatorship, who later became president of Brazil.
What happened throughout the 1970s is not just a police dictatorship. It is simply the impossibility of telling the truth under any circumstances. Why? Because the right to free expression was buried. There is no dialogue. It's not possible to assume that there is a dialogue at the torture pole with electric shock and death. It is not possible to assume that there is a dialogue, and that is what is important today in Brazilian democracy. Any comparison between the military dictatorship and Brazilian democracy can only come from those who do not value Brazilian democracy.
Jair Bolsonaro, on the other hand, not just justified torture, but even promoted it on national TV, saying it's something he believes in. We asked Frei Betto why he thinks international capital and foreign powers didn't support a potential coup attempt this time around.
Sim, o grande capital está dividido.
Yes, big capital is divided. There is a part that supports Bolsonaro, there is a part that supports Lula, and there is a part that is divided between the two. In other words, very opportunistic. It depends on where the winds blow. In any case, there is an international situation that is very favorable to Lula. Both the European Union and the United States government, Biden personally, have shown a lot of support for Lula. And above all, these people have condemned the Bolsonaro government for its aggression against the Amazon, for its devastation of our biomes, and all the destruction of the jungles of Brazil. Brazil really is a privileged country from an ecological point of view. So now Lula has appointed Marina Silva to take care of the environment, and that had a very favorable, very positive impact. So I think that if you ask me why Bolsonaro, who wanted to carry out a military coup to return the military dictatorship to Brazil, did not succeed, it is exactly because he did not have international support, or he knew that he did not have support from the United States, from the White House, or the European Union. He had no power, only the military. In the exercises that they did to practice a coup, he could not advance. He could not advance because even the Brazilian armed forces knew that he did not have international support. So I think that now those market people are also going to have to accept being there with Lula, because Lula is not against the market, but he is very aware that the rights of the poorest must be prioritized. He himself has said that he is satisfied if he can guarantee all the Brazilian people 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And on this he is working.
Bolsonaro desapareció políticamente.
Bolsonaro disappeared politically. Even his own political bloc abandoned his far-right party, the Liberal Party. The other former allies all approached the government and are participating in some way in Lula's government alliance. So Bolsonarism was hurt mostly by Bolsonaro. Lula even said it the other day that the feelings of extreme right-wing radicalism is still present in medium-sized and even popular sectors. The success of the Lula government will be its traditional model of economic development, priority of social policies, income distribution, job creation, etc., and incorporating ecological issues from the previous Lula government. Results will be obtained on a fight that worsened in the 4 years of Bolsonaro's government.